In this video, we're going to have a look at how to apply advanced conditional formatting within Planning Analytics Workspace. Now, I put advanced in air quotes because the sort of requests that we are getting for users for this formatting are actually quite simple. It's not inherently obvious within Workspace sometimes how to make that work. So I have a very simple input view here, where there's a revenue template that I would ask users to input their revenue forecasts into per store. Now, my conditional formatting options within here are for me to click on the measure, so I right click and go to conditional format, and I have the member that I would like my values to be based on. Now, my input template only contains the revenue member, so I can't base it on something else. And I have the options of how I want to do my comparison. So I can compare that member with another member if I had any in my view, but again, I don't. But for example, I could do something like where revenue is greater than cost of sales only if I have cost of sales in this view. My other option is to base it off the cell values themselves. So the value or text that is within the cells. In this case, it is numbers, so it is value. And then I have some basic numerical operators in here. So whether I want it to be greater than, for example, let's say I want it to be greater than 15,000, I can choose what sort of formatting I want to apply. So let's make it a simple green without any borders, and I can make it italic, and I can put some little icons on it. And I can apply that. And it's a very basic type of formatting, but based on what options I have in here, you can start to think that that's all you have available. So if I save that, it does this, which is great, but why would you ever want to do that? You wouldn't. It's very rare that you're going to want to base something just on whether a value is higher than a certain number or not. So I will remove that formatting, and we'll talk about some examples that are actually quite common. So for example, here it is an input template, and my template includes some months that are in the past and some months that are in the future. Now I will dictate with security which cells the users can type into, but it's also nice if you've got a book with multiple input screens to just use conditional formatting to highlight immediately in an obvious way what is actual and what is forecast, i.e. actuals don't change this, it's a fact, versus forecast, you need to type something here. Now to do that, if we were working with something like Excel, where we immediately think of this as a really easy conditional format to apply, what do we need? Our starting point is we need something that tells us which months are actuals and which months are forecasts. Normally it's a little control screen or a control tab that we have that has those tabs that we can do lookups against. So that way the same template can be used one month after the next. In Workspace, we need the same sort of idea. So we need something which flags which months are actuals and which months are forecast. And I already have that. And I expect any planning application you likely will as well. So I have a cube here called sysplan period control. And in here it's simply my version and time dimensions. And I flag with a 1, as we see here. The 1s indicate the months which are forecast, and the 0s indicate which months are actuals. So I already have the information to drive my formatting, but there's a problem. And that problem is that I need that same information to be in the same cube where we are doing our inputs. Because for us to be able to do the formatting, we need to have that information in the same view. Not just the same cube, it actually needs to be in the same view. So I need to translate this into the cube somehow. So I will go to Plan Store Sales, and I would do something like going to my measures dimension and adding a new member. So in that case, I would do something like actual flag. And you can have it as numerical string. It doesn't matter as long as it is something to define this information. So then with a rule, what I'll do, and we already have a forecast flag here. So as we can see, this is logic I have actually applied in this model before, but let's do the opposite of it for some reason. So you have a very simple rule in this case, where you need that information to be available for all of your intersections. So I made it a string, and then what you do is look up to that other cube which we were looking at before, which is sysplan period control, the version and time dimension that exists in here, and I want it to be based on the forecast measure. So when that forecast is a 1, I want it to then do something like say it's forecast, whereas if it is a 0, I want it to be saying actual. And we just simply click save. Now, because I'm only using this to drive my formatting and I don't need to add these values up, I don't need to feed this, so it has very little overhead to my system, so it has no real impact at all. But if I now go back to my input screen, what I need to do is bring that member into here, into my view. So I find that member and I put it in here with my revenue measure as well. And then if I unsuppress zeros, which is why that is not showing, we now have revenue and actual flag in here. And we see some of them are forecast and some of them are actual. Now, when I go to the conditional format option, I can choose that actual flag in here, and I can do it based on text. So I can choose contains or equals. If it contains act, I want to put some grey formatting on those columns. And just to be absolutely certain, I also want to have my forecast ones as white, again, without a border. And I will apply that. So now we have a really simple screen where the users immediately can see there is a break between the actual months and the forecast months. So as long as you use that same formatting in all of your time-based inputs, it is really obvious to them where they are supposed to do their inputs and where they are supposed to ignore. There is, of course, a problem with this, which is now we have this really ugly actual flag measure in here, which adds no value to the user whatsoever. And I need it to be in here to drive my formatting, but I can hide it. So the way that MDX views work in Workspace is that when you hide a member, it's still part of your view, even though the user can't see it. And because it's still part of the view, we can use it in the conditional formatting, as we see here. So that's one really simple type of formatting that almost every planning model would want to apply, because they're almost always based on time, and normally you are going to be showing some degree of actuals and some degree of forecast. There are other things that I quite often apply though. So one thing I find with planning systems is, let's go back into the template. So even when I'm only asking my users to input the forecast months, I'm asking them to input a very big grid of data here. And no matter how they are providing this information, maybe they're just typing it directly in, maybe they're using data spreading options, maybe they're copying and pasting the data in from Excel or somewhere else where they've worked it out externally. It doesn't matter, it's a big grid of data. So there's a chance they're going to make mistakes. And it's the sort of mistakes that when you're looking at the individual thing and you're thinking about June 2022 for the Queensway store, you're not going to make a mistake. But when you're doing all of this at the same time, it's easy to do silly things, such as accidentally having a negative in there. Or if you've copied and pasted it from somewhere else, maybe you've ended up with your comma in the wrong place or your dot in the wrong place. All of a sudden what you thought was 1,000 is now 1,000,000 or 1. Very easy mistakes to make. So I like to put validations in. And I do this by going to the users and saying to them, what sort of mistakes happen? What sort of things are easy for you to do that you would rather not do? And quite often they're very forthcoming, because these are mistakes that they know they shouldn't be making and they don't want to make, but it just happens. So in my rules, I have some in here for members I've specified. So for everything where a user says to me, sometimes I do this thing and I shouldn't, I then create a validation rule for it. So for example, when you're doing your revenue, you shouldn't have any negative values in there because it's a revenue forecast and plan. So I then put a very simple rule in place where I say if the revenue is less than 0 and the store is open in that month, then put a 1 in the cell. Otherwise leave it as a 0. And I do that for a lot of different validations. And then that allows me to do this on the inputs, where in the same way we did for the forecast flag, I would bring in those validation measures. And I tend to do it by creating a validation rules consolidation. And within that, I tend to have 2 sub consolidations. So hard validations and soft validations. And in my mind, hard validations are the things where a user should never do it, i.e. negative revenue. If it's there, they have made a mistake and they need to fix it. The other ones, soft validations, they're the sort of things where I go, the data that you've provided here looks questionable, but it could be right. So I just want you to have another look at it and confirm that it's correct before you submit your plan, before you turn your PC off and go home. So these are the sort of things where it might be, for example, if your December 2022 value is greater than December 2021 by a very significant variance. So let's say your year-on-year variance tends to be 20% at most. But if all of a sudden they have a 4,000% growth in a given month, maybe that's something they should look at a second time. So what I'll do is I'll bring over that consolidation and click apply and close. And straight away, I'm going to hide that from this view because I don't want to look at it. So now in my conditional formatting, I'll add some extra members. So we had that consolidation in there, and I can expand it out because it was a consolidation. So for the hard validations, now if there's a 1, or if it's greater than 0 in any case, I would want to make that a sort of reddish colour to say, you really need to fix this. Whereas something like a soft validation, I would go, let's make this a yellowish colour, something that you perhaps want to look at again. And now we're starting to get a lot of rules in here, and this is where we need to think about the order of them. So the same cell could trigger both a hard validation and a soft validation. And because in this case I've got my soft validations at the top, the cell would go yellow before it goes red. But of course, a hard validation is more important because it's definitely wrong. So what I need to do is make sure that that one is at the top. And then when I apply this, then the user gets some sort of indication of how good their plan is. And obviously with this test system I have in place, I have some very strange data. So I have a lot that is wrong with my plans. Hopefully you wouldn't see that many validations triggering in a real application. But this is the sort of thing that can happen. One final suggestion I will make with those sorts of validations is be aware. Something we don't talk about very often is color blindness is incredibly common. So if when I was going through the formatting options we have available to us before, you looked at the icons and thought, when would I ever use those? They don't really seem that useful. For someone who is colorblind, they may not notice a red cell straight away. But if you put a square in a cell, then that is quite obvious to them. So that is when you can start using the icons to make it really obvious. But as you see here, the way Workspace has been set up is that those icons take up quite a lot of space. So if you do it, you need to make your columns wide enough to make sure that the number and the icon is visible. But it's something you should very much consider whether it is necessary for your application or not to have something more than just a color format available to indicate to users what you want to tell them. But that is generally how to apply various types of advanced conditional formatting within Planning Analytics Workspace. It is always very simple. You need to be a modeler or an admin, create an element in your cube to define and act as a driver for the formatting you are going to show, and populate that in some way, whether it be by rules or possibly by TI. I tend to go with rules. And then add it into your view. It needs to be part of the view for this to work. And then you can do your conditional formatting on it. And 9 times out of 10, you probably want to hide that thing because it wasn't in your view to start with. Otherwise, you wouldn't be looking at this video, as it would have actually been in your view, and it would be incredibly easy to work out how you need to apply that formatting. So they are the simple steps to apply advanced conditional formatting, by which I mean really basic conditional formatting.